China has made clear that it intends to continue its military maneuvers around the Taiwan Straits. For perspective on where this confrontation between Taiwan and China could go from here, we're joined on this broadcast by Professor Steve Tsang. Professor Steve Tsang is a leading political historian, director of the School of Oriental and Africa Studies China Institute. Importantly, he's the author of a book, If China Attacks Taiwan, Military Strategy, Politics and Economics. So he spent his lifetime academically studying Taiwan and China and deeply researching just the kind of situation that is playing itself out now after US Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit. Professor Tsang, thank you for your time and welcome to India Today.
You're welcome.
Your book is in three parts: military strategy, politics and economics of what happens if China attacks Taiwan. So I'll take it one by one and I'll start with military strategy. We're seeing multiple military maneuvers by the Chinese Navy, by the Chinese Air Force around Taiwan. From what you've seen so far sitting in London, what do you make of the kind of military strategy that we've seen playing itself out over the past few days? Is China just flexing its muscles, or do you think it's preparing for war?
I think at this stage, China is flexing its muscle. China is sending a clear warning to Taiwan and to the United States that China will be able to sustain a blockade of Taiwan and do other actions that could result in China taking Taiwan. But the reality is that at the moment, they are not yet confident that they have the necessary capacities to do so. Their preferred solution is that by demonstrating China has overwhelming military superiority, they will be able to force the government in Taipei to negotiate for peace, which from their perspective is reunification with China, and that will basically remove the problem. And short of that, they will be launching surgical strikes, a kind of decapitation operation to take out Taiwan's leadership and again force Taiwan to capitulate. A full-scale amphibious assault would be the last option.
How do you think Taiwan is likely to react to these military maneuvers? Initially, after Speaker Pelosi went, Taiwan issued condemnation but didn't react militarily when Chinese fighter jets crossed over the median line. Now Taiwan seems to be issuing stronger statements. Do you think they'll just lie low and hope that China backs down, or how do you see militarily Taiwan react to these Chinese military maneuvers?
I think the Taiwanese government has responded in a very measured and responsible way. Now, the reality is that the Chinese government miscalculated. They launched the military exercises and have to be so aggressive because their early warning to the United States to deter Pelosi from visiting Taiwan totally failed. They should have known that it could never have worked. But having failed to deter Pelosi to visit Taiwan, Xi Jinping cannot afford to appear soft on Taiwan or on the Americans, and therefore needs to project power in such an aggressive way. So in this context, if the Taiwanese have responded either very aggressively with their military deployment or dismiss the Chinese military exercise as really nothing to see here, then it will get Xi Jinping to have to redouble his efforts and get even more aggressive. So by playing it down and say that we are concerned, but not reacting too much, make it possible for Xi Jinping not to have to escalate further.
Looked at militarily, do you think Taiwan has the capacity to defend itself? You said an amphibious Chinese assault would really be the last option if it were to come to that. So much is said about Taiwan's porcupine-like defense strategy. How do you see an actual military conflict play out between Taiwan and China?
Taiwan is a very significant medium power with a well-trained defense force which will hold its own for a while. But China is a military superpower. So there is a significant mismatch in military capability. But even in this unequal competition, the Chinese will have to cross the very difficult waters of the Taiwan Strait to mount an amphibious assault against Taiwan. It's a very difficult operation in the best of time. And of course, with Taiwanese resisting, it will be even more difficult. Having said that, we also have to bear in mind that modern warfare use up ammunition very quickly, and resupplying those ammunitions and equipment is not going to be easy for Taiwan, as Taiwan will have to face a Chinese naval and air blockade in the event of a Chinese invasion. But the Taiwanese, I think, have always calculated that in such a scenario, they will be able to call on the United States for support, as the United States has a domestic law, the Taiwan Relations Act, that will require the administration of the day to consult Congress for an appropriate response if an attempt is made for the status of Taiwan to be changed against the will of the people of Taiwan.
Between Ukraine and Russia and the war that's going on at this moment, and Taiwan and China, what are the similarities and dissimilarities as you see it? Ukraine, to a much smaller power, up against a much bigger power in Russia. Russia no longer the Russia that it used to be, and no longer a patch on the military and economic might of China at this moment. What are your similarities and dissimilarities between these two hostilities?
I think we are comparing fairly different kind of war scenario here. Ukraine and Russia, we are really talking about a land war supplemented with air warfare with relatively small elements of naval involvement. And the importance of Ukraine to the United States was somewhat marginal rather than critical. In the Taiwan case, the war will in the first instance be primarily air and naval and non-traditional type of operations, cyber, sabotage, special forces, and other kinds of infiltrations. The land war will come as the last phase of any operations, assuming the Chinese were successful in the other earlier phases. And of course, Taiwan is strategically very important to the United States in a way that Ukraine simply isn't. Ukraine is important for the psychology of Europe and for NATO, but is really not critical to American global positions and strategy. Taiwan, very much important. If the Americans cannot be trusted to help Taiwan, the Japanese will no longer rely on the Americans under the Japan-US Mutual Defense Treaty. Same will apply to South Korea, and the 10 nations of the ASEAN will all believe that they cannot count on the Americans and will do their own deals with China. So we're talking about a basic change in the global strategic balance if the Americans should fail to respond to a Taiwan crisis, either by
Do you think America will come to Taiwan's defense, given that they've had strategic ambiguity on this question? President Biden saying that he will come militarily to Taiwan's defense, but Biden's office then dialing back on that promise by the president multiple times over. At this moment, given that this is the topic that you research and study, what's your best sense? If Taiwan were to be attacked by China, would the United States come militarily to Taiwan's defense?
The American strategic ambiguity concept is often misunderstood. The strategic ambiguity essentially says that if Taiwan were to provoke a crisis across the Taiwan Strait, which resulted in the Chinese government using force, the government in Taipei cannot automatically count on the Americans to come to its assistance. But it's much clearer if Taiwan were not the cause of a crisis, that China initiates a military operation against Taiwan without Taiwan provoking, then the chance is that the United States government will come to Taiwan's aid. Now, a lot of it will ride on the opinions in the United States Congress, because the Taiwan Relations Act does not authorize the president to take military actions of his own bat. It requires the president to consult Congress. And with the structural change in relationship between China and the United States and the general hardening of opinions in the United States Congress, it's becoming increasingly difficult to see a Congress not supporting the United States using force to help Taiwan defend itself.
Okay, I said I'll do this interview in 3 parts, which are 3 parts of your book. If China attacks Taiwan, military strategy, we've spoken a bit about that. I now want to come to politics. Politics in Taiwan, politics in China, politics in the United States. So I'll start with China. President Xi Jinping set for a big party Congress come October. How does that put additional pressure on him? Because the economy is on a downturn in mainland China. He's up for re-election in a potential 3rd term. How does that dynamic impact what we're seeing in the Taiwan Straits at this moment?
Well, it means that Xi Jinping will not want to use force against Taiwan before the 20th Party Congress. He's done a lot of preparations to make sure that he gets a 3rd term as leader of China at the 20th Party Congress, which will need to be confirmed at the National People's Congress in the spring of 2023. An operation against Taiwan inherently is difficult to predict. So why would Xi Jinping want to take a risk on a war not going to plan? So I don't think it will actually get him to act more aggressively in terms of launching a war. I think it will deter him from launching a war. But over the longer term, I think we're looking at a very different story. Xi Jinping is committed to the so-called, what he calls the China dream of national rejuvenation. This is a goal that cannot be claimed to have been achieved if what he also calls as the sacred territory of Taiwan is not made part of China again. So we are looking at, over the longer term, a Xi Jinping government that will be committed to do whatever it takes to take Taiwan.
Now, there is no clear answer to this, Professor Tsang, but in your best estimate, from President Xi Jinping's perspective, when would be the ideal time to achieve his dream of the reunification of China? If he were to plan it according to his calendar, when is he most likely to attack?
Probably 10 to 15 or at most 20 years, probably 10 to 15 years. He will want to wait until the People's Liberation Army have got the capabilities to get the job done with confidence. He will also want to get it done before he gets too old, towards the end of his term as a leader of China. He probably calculates that he will have at least another 20, if not longer years, as leader of China, and it needs to be done within that time frame.
So far, he seems to be indicating a naval blockade strategy, where you basically cut off Taiwan, and that's the message that you send to the Taiwanese people and government. Do you think they have the military capability from a naval perspective to be able to enforce a naval blockade of Taiwan?
Well, the Chinese have just demonstrated they can start and maintain a naval blockade of Taiwan with relatively short notice for a relatively short period of time. Sustaining it will be a lot more difficult, but then a lot of naval blockade is in terms of deterrence rather than actually constantly maintaining a very high level of force for the effective blockading of the country you want to blockade. So yes, I think we should work on the basis that they have the capability. The issue really is not whether they can or cannot do it, but whether the Taiwanese and with American support, we'll be able to break that blockade.
How is America likely to react politically after Speaker Pelosi's visit? During the last Taiwan crisis, we saw American naval ships pass through the Taiwan Straits. China tried to ward that off, didn't succeed. Now China much more competitive from a naval perspective. Will America push through, or would they like to politically lay low and not antagonize China further?
Well, the Biden administration, again, has been very careful in trying to minimize the scope for unintended escalations, which explains why Pelosi's planes was routed to avoid South China Sea and airspace that the Chinese Air Force or air defense system could operate effectively. But the sending of U.S. naval ships through the Taiwan Strait, which is international waters, is a different matter. The Americans will resume the freedom of navigation operations across the Taiwan Strait. They may not do it immediately, but they will certainly continue their regular freedom of navigation operations.
What's your assessment of the will of the Taiwanese people to fight China at this moment? Opinion is divided. A large section seems to favor some notion of being away from China. The Ukrainian people have fought heroically against the Russian army. If you were to compare in an international context, what's your assessment of the will of the Taiwanese state to fight back against China?
Never underestimate the determination of citizens of democracies fighting for their own freedom. Before the Second World War started in the United Kingdom, the Oxford Union had a debate, and the team won the argument that this house does not believe in fighting for king and country. When war started, everyone in the debating team that won joined the war effort. I think that is the sort of things that we have to expect that people in Taiwan will do. When their homeland and their way of life and everything they treasure, not in terms of the material bit, but in terms of the democracy and way of life, they will stand their ground and fight. That is something which I think the Chinese government need to take.
I want to come now to the last part of this interview, which is to do with the economics. Your book is on military strategy, politics, and economics. We've discussed the first two. I now want to focus on the economics. Given how dark it is inside mainland China to accurately pick up macroeconomic trends from China, how much is the downturn in the economy putting pressure on President Xi Jinping to be aggressive militarily on the question of Taiwan? Because earlier the Chinese state promised economic growth to the people of mainland China. To what extent has that promise now taken a hit?
Well, China's economy is slowing down quite significantly, and a lot of that has to do with the dynamic zero-COVID policy. And the Chinese economy is also suffering from the fallout from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, like other major economies. I mean, Taiwan is not the reason why China's economy is slowing down or in trouble. Will Xi Jinping invade Taiwan because the economy is slowing down? No, I don't think so. Reason number one, the Chinese economy is not doing well, but it is not facing a catastrophe. There is no need for Xi Jinping to cause that kind of a diversion, which would simply make the economic challenges even greater. And the second one is that Taiwan is primarily a political issue for China, and the decision for invading Taiwan or not will be a political one rather than an economic-based one.
What's your reading of whether the real estate crisis and the debt crisis in China, of which so much is said and written, could actually blow up into something much bigger? You can already hear the simmering discontent around the pile-up around the debt crisis and around the real estate bubble. Could it blow up in Xi Jinping's face, and what kind of a timeline could that involve?
Well, the economic bubble in China probably will burst at some stage. Nobody knows when it's going to burst. But given that Xi Jinping is determined to stay as leader of China for the next 10, 20, perhaps even longer years, the chances that it is going to blow up while Xi Jinping is in charge in China.
Do you think that there's any threat at all or any circumstance in which there could be a threat to Xi Jinping's continuance as president? Do you think that's really a given that he's taken some action against all his key political opponents?
Well, Xi Jinping is politically very astute. He has taken consistently very wide range of actions against his political opponents within the party, and it is opponents within his party who are much more serious threats to him than anybody dissidents outside of the Communist Party establishment. So at the moment, all the signs are that Xi Jinping is very firmly in control, in spite of the kind of problems that we can see China is facing right now.
And economically, we've seen the Chinese state impose certain sanctions on Taiwan after Speaker Pelosi's visit, but those have been largely on food items, not something substantial like semiconductor chips, which would not just hurt Taiwan but also impact the Chinese economy and in turn the global economy. Could these economic sanctions increase in the days and weeks and months to come, you think?
Some other elements of economic sanctions are likely to be introduced, but the Chinese will try to make sure that whatever they do will hurt Taiwan a lot more than it will hurt China itself. So some of your highly sought after technological exports from Taiwan, they are unlikely to be on China's list because the Chinese economy will need them perhaps even more than the Taiwanese economy needs them.
I have one last question, and I ask this only because you've actually spent a lifetime researching the question of China attacking Taiwan. If this were to happen, how do you see the scenario unfold? Do you see it as a long battle of attrition, Taiwan hitting and pushing back like Ukraine is doing against Russia, or do you see China becoming so strong militarily and economically that when it does come in, Taiwan, despite initially trying to mount a valiant fight back, will ultimately not be able to push back?
I think what we have to be seeing, expecting to see, is that the first couple of days of the Chinese assault will be absolutely critical. I think the Chinese government are planning and hoping that they will be able to mount surgical strikes that will take out Taiwan's leadership and change everything in a matter of days, if not hours. I think that's very unlikely to be successful for many, many reasons. Not least that Taiwan has, as a democracy, has a very clear line of succession, and therefore even if whoever happened to be president at the time in Taiwan were killed in the first wave of Chinese attack, a government will continue to function in Taiwan, and that government will have to act in accordance with the wishes of the people of Taiwan, which I think is likely to be one that is determined to defend Taiwan's democracy. Then we are talking about a much more difficult period of naval and air operations, and unless the Chinese can be extremely effective in taking out Taiwan's naval and air defense, they are not likely to be able to mount a successful amphibious assault. If that is the case, and with the Americans coming in to help Taiwan in terms of its air and naval defense, we are probably going to look at a bit of a stalemate that could have very, very major global economic consequences, not only for Taiwan and China, but for the rest of the world.
You know, no one has clear answers to these rather unknown waters, but you've shed some very sharp insights into each of those very tricky questions. Professor Steve Tsang, I know that you're being hounded the world over for interviews, interactions, your insights, for taking out time for the news track and joining us on India Today. Thank you very much. I deeply, truly appreciate your time. Thank you, sir.